There are many ways to understand night. For most people today, it is the time when work ends, when screens glow in darkened rooms, when the body rests until morning returns. It is a gap in the day, a pause, sometimes inconvenient but rarely mysterious. But for the people who lived in the far north 1,000 years ago, those who spoke Old Norse, who sailed stormy seas and carved runes into stone, night meant something entirely different. In their world, night was not an absence, but a presence. It was a goddess riding across the sky on a horse whose mane dripped frost onto the valleys below. It was a realm where the soul could wander free from the body, moving through landscapes that the waking mind could never see. It was a time when the barriers between the living and the dead, between gods and mortals, between the known world and the hidden ones, grew thin enough to cross. The Old Norse tales, preserved in the Eddas, in sagas, and in the whispered folklore that survived long after the Viking Age, speak of night not as empty darkness, but as a threshold, a place of transition, a passage between worlds. Those who lay down to sleep in a wooden longhouse on a winter evening did not simply close their eyes and disappear into unconsciousness. They entered another kind of reality, one where dreams carried messages, where spirits moved close, and where the boundary of the self became uncertain. This understanding shaped how people lived. It influenced when they traveled, what they did after sunset, how they interpreted the visions that came in sleep, and what precautions they took to protect themselves from the beings who moved more freely in darkness. Night was not feared in the simple sense. Vikings were not a timid people, but it was respected. It demanded attention, caution, and a certain kind of courage. In this story, we will walk slowly through the Old Norse night as it appears in myth and folktale. We will meet Nótt, the goddess whose name simply means night, and learn how she was woven into the cosmic order. We will listen to the tales of creatures who belonged to darkness, elves, spirits, and stranger things. We will explore what the Vikings believed happened to the soul during sleep, and why dreams were treated as important, even dangerous communications. And we will consider what it meant to live in a place where winter nights stretched for months, where darkness was not occasional but defining, and where the old stories offered a way to understand and endure the long hours when the sun stayed hidden. By the end, night may feel different to you, not just as the time when you sleep, but as a space with its own inhabitants, its own rules, and its own ancient, half-forgotten meaning. In Norse cosmology, night was not simply a condition or a time of day. It was a being, a goddess named Nótt, whose name in Old Norse means exactly what it sounds like, night. She appears in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, the primary sources for Norse mythology, as the personification of darkness, the daughter of a giant named Nervi, also called Narfi or Nur. Nótt was more than a symbolic figure. The myths describe her as an active participant in the structure of the cosmos. She rode across the sky each evening in a chariot pulled by a horse named Hrimfaxi, which means frost mane. As Hrimfaxi galloped through the heavens, foam fell from his bit, and this foam became the dew that covered valleys and fields each morning. The image is vivid. Night was not a curtain falling, but a journey, a powerful divine figure crossing the world, leaving traces of her passage in the cold moisture that clung to grass and stone at dawn. This personification had practical and psychological weight. For people living in the far north, where winter nights could stretch for months, understanding night as a deity, someone with agency, genealogy, and place in the cosmic order, gave it dignity. Night was not an enemy or a void. It was Nótt, daughter of giants, mother of the earth in some genealogies, and an essential part of the rhythm that held the world together. In one of the Eddic poems, Vafthrudnismal, the god Odin asks the wise giant Vafthrudnir about the origins of day and night. The giant replies that Delling, a god associated with dawn, is the father of day, while night was born of Nervi.
This genealogy placed night within the family structures that defined Norse cosmology, neither fully divine in the sense of the Asir gods, nor fully monstrous, but somewhere in between, tied to the ancient forces that shaped the world before the gods established their order. Nótt had several marriages, each producing significant offspring. In one account, her third husband was Delingr, god of dawn, and together they had a son named Dag, Day. This made night and day siblings, or at least closely related, emphasizing their interdependence. One could not exist without the other. Day rode his own horse, Skinfoxy, Shining Mane, whose bright mane illuminated the sky. The two, night and day, chased each other across the heavens in an eternal cycle, neither triumphant, both necessary. This balance was central to Norse thought. The cosmos was not a place of simple oppositions, but of dynamic tensions, order and chaos, fire and ice, light and dark. Nótt represented one half of a fundamental duality, and her presence in the mythology signaled that darkness was not to be banished or despised, but honored as part of the structure of existence. In prayers and poetry, night was invoked alongside day. In the poem Sigdrifumal, the Valkyrie Sigdrivrifa awakens and offers a blessing that addresses both. Hail to the day, hail to the sons of day, to night and her daughter, hail. This pairing shows that night was not excluded from reverence or gratitude. It had its own blessings to offer, its own role in sustaining life. For those living through the long Arctic nights, this mythological framing mattered. When the sun disappeared for weeks or months, it was not abandonment or punishment. It was simply Nótt riding her course, frost dripping from her horse's mane, holding the dark hours in her hands until Dag returned. The goddess made the darkness comprehensible, even companionable. She transformed it from a formless threat into a figure one could address, respect, and wait for patiently to pass.
If Nótt ruled the sky, other beings populated the darkness below. Old Norse cosmology was crowded with non-human entities, many of whom moved more freely at night or dwelled in places the sun never touched. The most prominent among these were the Alfar, elves, but not the delicate, ethereal figures of later fantasy. In Norse belief, elves were powerful, ambiguous, and divided into at least two categories: the Ljós Alfar, light elves, and the Dökk Alfar, dark elves. The Ljós Alfar were said to be fairer than the sun and lived in Alfheimr, a bright realm associated with sky and light. The Dökk Alfar, by contrast, were described as blacker than pitch and dwelled underground in Svartalfheim, a shadowy world beneath the earth. These dark elves were not simply evil, but they were dangerous. They represented chthonic forces, connected to death, the earth's depths, and the unseen currents that ran beneath the visible world. In folklore, the Dökk Alfar could bring illness, nightmares, and misfortune to those who angered them. They were sometimes conflated with dwarves, who also lived underground and worked in darkness, forging powerful objects and hoarding hidden knowledge. The boundaries between these categories were not always clear, which reflects the fluidity of Norse cosmology. What mattered was the recognition that darkness housed beings with their own agency, their own power, and their own reasons for interacting, or not, with humans. Night was also the time when spirits of the dead could move. The Norse believed that the boundary between the living and the dead was porous, especially in certain seasons and at certain times. Ghosts, known as draugr, could walk in darkness, often with hostile intent. These were not gentle spirits, but reanimated corpses, sometimes supernaturally strong, who guarded their graves or pursued old grudges. Encountering a draugr at night was a genuine fear, and many folk tales describe warriors or travelers who had to fight or outwit these beings after sunset. There were also less defined presences, landvatir, land spirits who protected specific places,
Vitir, spirits of various kinds who inhabited forests, rivers, and stones, and the Holdufolk, hidden people, who might be seen or sensed at twilight or in the deep night. These beings demanded respect. Travelers might leave offerings, avoid certain paths after dark, or speak carefully when moving through wild places at night, lest they offend something they could not see. This populated darkness shaped behavior. Night was not a time for casual wandering. Work ceased at sunset not only because of the lack of light, but because the world after dark belonged in part to beings who did not always welcome human presence. Stories served as both entertainment and warning. They taught children and newcomers what might happen if you ventured too far alone, if you ignored dreams, if you disrespected the old places. Yet the creatures of darkness were not uniformly hostile. Some could be negotiated with, honored, or even befriended. The relationship was not one of pure fear, but of caution and respect. A recognition that the night world operated by different rules, and that humans, while not helpless, were not the only actors on the stage. This understanding cultivated a certain humility and attentiveness. You listened more carefully. You watched where you stepped. You learned the signs that told you whether the night around you was simply dark, or whether something else was present. One of the most striking aspects of Old Norse belief was the understanding of what happened to the self during sleep. The Vikings did not see sleep as a simple shutdown of consciousness. Instead, they believed that when a person slept, part of the soul, the hugger, could leave the body and wander. The hugger was one of several components of the Norse self. It can be roughly translated as thought, mind, or spirit, but it was more than an abstract quality. It was a mobile, active part of the person, capable of moving through space, encountering other beings, and bringing back information in the form of dreams. When someone fell asleep, especially deeply, the hugger might slip out and travel to other places, distant lands, the realms of the dead, or the halls of gods and spirits. This belief made dreams intensely significant. They were not random firings of neurons or symbolic puzzles for the unconscious to solve. They were reports from the hugger's journeys. A dream in which you saw a distant friend might mean your hugger had actually visited them. A dream in which a dead relative spoke to you might be a genuine encounter with their spirit. A dream in which a god appeared was not fantasy, but visitation. Because of this, dreams were taken seriously. Warriors might interpret a dream before battle as a message from Odin, who was known to visit men in their sleep and offer cryptic guidance or warnings. A troubling dream could lead to changes in plans, to rituals of protection, or to consultations with those skilled in interpreting such visions. Dreams of the dead were particularly important. They might bring news, warnings, or demands for action, offerings owed, debts unpaid, wrongs to be righted. There was also danger in this nightly wandering. If the hugger traveled too far, or if it encountered hostile beings, it might not return easily. The body, left empty, could become vulnerable. Some tales describe people falling into deep, unnatural sleeps from which they could not wake because their hugger was trapped or lost. Others tell of beings who could steal or harm the wandering hugger, causing illness, madness, or death. This fear of the vulnerable sleeping self appears in various protective practices. People might place iron near the bed, since iron was believed to ward off certain spirits. They might recite prayers or charms before sleep. They might avoid sleeping in certain places known to be dangerous, places where spirits were strong, where battles had been fought, or where the dead were buried close by. Children were taught to be careful about what they said before sleep and to pay attention to their dreams. Certain dreams required action, a gift to a spirit, a change in behavior, or simply the telling of the dream to someone wiser who could interpret it. To ignore a significant dream was to ignore a message from the other side of the veil, and that could bring consequences. The goddess Nótt herself was sometimes associated with dreams as the ruler of the hours when the hugger wandered. She was not only the personification of darkness, but also the presiding power over the inner journeys that took place while the body rested. In this sense, she was both guardian and gateway. She held the space in which the soul could leave the flesh and return safely, but she also oversaw the threshold that, once crossed, led into realms where human control was limited. This belief gave the night a double character. On one hand, sleep was necessary, restorative, and even sacred, a time when knowledge and connection could come from beyond the waking world. On the other hand, sleep was a risk. Each night the self left home and ventured into uncertainty. Most mornings it returned intact, but not always.
Given these beliefs, it is no surprise that the Old Norse world had strong ideas about what should and should not be done after dark. Daylight was the time for travel, for battle, for major work and communal gatherings. Night was for rest, for the household, and for the kinds of quiet, indoor tasks that did not require venturing far from the fire. Traveling at night was generally avoided unless necessity demanded it. The risks were not only practical, difficult terrain, lack of visibility, but spiritual. A lone traveler on a dark road might encounter spirits, elves, or worse. Tales abound of those who ignored this wisdom and paid the price, led astray by lights that danced in the marshes, confronted by Draugr who guarded old burial mounds, or simply vanishing into the dark, never to be found. Even within the household, certain activities were reserved for daylight. Major decisions, important conversations, and any work involving sharp tools or fire were ideally done when the sun was up. Night was for quieter things, storytelling, handwork by the firelight, and the slow winding down toward sleep. This division helped maintain a boundary between the active, human-dominated hours and the liminal, spirit-inhabited ones. There were exceptions. Certain rituals, particularly those involving divination or communication with spirits, might be performed at night precisely because the veil was thinner then. Seidr, the Old Norse practice of magic and prophecy, often associated with women, sometimes took place in darkness, when the practitioner could more easily reach into the hidden realms. But these were specialized activities, undertaken by those trained and protected by knowledge and ritual. They were not casual ventures into the night's mysteries. For most people, the night meant gathering indoors, lighting the fire, and drawing the household close. The longhouse, with its central hearth and thick walls, became a fortress against both physical cold and spiritual danger. Stories told around the fire served multiple purposes. They entertained, they taught, and they reinforced the boundaries. The tales of those who went out at night and came back changed, or did not come back at all, were reminders that the darkness beyond the door was not empty and not entirely safe. Children, especially, were taught to respect the night. They learned not to wander off after dark, not to answer voices calling from outside unless they were certain of the source, and not to stare too long into the darkness beyond the firelight. These were not arbitrary rules, but practical wisdom shaped by centuries of living in a world where the night was understood to be shared with other, older powers. In this way, the Old Norse night shaped social rhythms and domestic architecture as much as belief shaped behavior. The structure of the day, the layout of the home, the timing of meals and sleep, all of these were influenced by the understanding that night was a threshold, a boundary, a time when the rules changed and different forces held sway.
For those who lived in the far northern reaches of Scandinavia, night was not only a daily occurrence, but a seasonal reality. In the depths of winter, the sun barely rose, or did not rise at all for weeks or even months. The polar night, Mørketid in Norwegian, turned the entire world into a twilight realm where the distinctions between day and night blurred into a single extended darkness. This long night tested endurance in every sense. Physically, the cold was relentless. Psychologically, the absence of the sun could weigh on the mind and spirit. But mythologically and spiritually, it was also a time of deepened connection to the old stories. When the world outside was locked in darkness for so long, the tales of Nótt and her frost-maned horse, of spirits moving through the shadows, and of the soul's nightly wanderings took on immediate lived relevance. People adapted. They learned to measure time differently, to find rhythms in the subtle shifts of twilight rather than the clear rise and fall of the sun. They developed rituals to mark the passage of the darkest weeks, feasts, sacrifices, storytelling marathons that could last through the long nights. The winter solstice, when the sun finally began its slow return, was celebrated not only as an astronomical event, but as a spiritual turning point, the moment when Nótt's dominion began to recede and Dagger's light would eventually return. In these conditions, the mythology of night was not abstract, it was part of survival. The stories helped people make sense of their experience, why the darkness felt so heavy, why dreams seemed more vivid and strange in winter, why the world outside the door felt so full of unseen presences. The myths gave shape to the formless anxiety that long darkness could bring, and they offered reassurance that this too was part of the cosmic order. Nótt would ride her course, and in time, her brother Dagger would follow. Those who lived through many such winters developed a certain relationship with darkness, neither pure fear or indifference, but a kind of respectful familiarity. They knew its moods, its dangers, and its gifts. They knew when it was safe to move and when it was wiser to stay inside. They knew how to read dreams, how to honor the spirits, and how to wait, patiently, for the light to return. This knowledge was passed down through generations in the form of stories, practices, and unspoken understanding. The Old Norse night was not something you conquered or ignored. It was something you learned to live with, to navigate, and to respect. It shaped character, patience, caution, attentiveness to signs, and a certain quiet courage in the face of the unknown.
The Viking Age ended 1,000 years ago, and Christianity gradually replaced the Old Norse religion. Yet traces of the earlier understanding of night lingered long in folklore, in rural customs, and in the half-conscious habits of people who no longer worshipped Nótt or feared the dark elves, but still felt, in some deep part of themselves, that night was different. Folktales from Scandinavia well into the modern era carried echoes of the old beliefs, stories of hidden people who must not be disturbed, of travelers who saw strange lights and followed them to their doom, of dreams that warned of coming events. Children were still told not to wander too far after dark, and certain places, old burial sites, deep forests, lonely crossroads, retained an aura of unease that rational explanations could not entirely dispel. Even today, in parts of rural Scandinavia, people speak of respecting the old ways, of not building on certain land, of leaving small offerings in the woods. These are not always framed in terms of ancient gods, but the structure of the practice is the same, an acknowledgement that the world contains more than what is visible, and that the night, in particular, deserves careful treatment. The modern celebration of winter darkness in Nordic countries, the candles, the emphasis on creating warm, lit interiors, the value placed on coziness and safety during the long nights, can be seen as a continuation of older instincts. The need to make the home a refuge, to light lamps carefully, to gather close during the dark months. These are not only practical, but also echo the ancient sense that night required ritual, attention, and respect. The Old Norse night is not entirely lost. It lives on in fragments,
in the way a winter evening feels in the north, in the stories still told around fires or dinner tables, in the quiet understanding that darkness is not empty but full, not simple but layered with meanings that daylight does not hold.
To understand what night meant in Old Norse folktales is to step into a worldview in which the boundaries we take for granted between waking and sleeping, between self and other, between the human world and the spirit world were thinner, more porous, more negotiable. Night was not a gap in the day, but a realm of its own, ruled by a goddess who rode a frost-maned horse across the sky, populated by elves and spirits who moved more freely in darkness, and experienced by humans as a time when the soul could leave the body and wander into places the waking mind could never reach. This understanding shaped how people lived. It influenced when they traveled, what they did after sunset, how they built their homes, and what stories they told their children. It gave them a way to make sense of the long Arctic nights, the strange vividness of dreams, and the uncanny feeling that sometimes comes in darkness, the sense that you are not entirely alone, even when no one else is visible. The myths and folk tales were not superstition in the dismissive sense. They were a framework for navigating a world that felt larger, stranger, and more populated than the purely material. They honored night as part of the cosmic balance, neither inferior to day nor something to be conquered, but necessary, powerful, and deserving of respect. Today, we live in a world where night has largely been tamed. Electric lights push back the darkness. Sleep is often treated as an inconvenience or a biological necessity, rather than a spiritual threshold. Dreams are analyzed as brain activity, rather than messages from wandering souls. Yet something of the Old Norse night still speaks to us, especially in the far north, where winter darkness is still a fact of life, and where the old stories are remembered. Perhaps what the Old Norse tales offer across the centuries is a reminder that night is more than the absence of light. It is a space with its own character, its own inhabitants, its own gifts and dangers. To treat it only as an interruption of productivity is to miss something essential, something the Vikings knew, something woven into their myths and lived experience. That the darkness holds mysteries, that sleep is a journey, and that the night, if you listen carefully, still has much to say. When you close your eyes tonight, you might remember Nótt riding her horse across the sky, frost dripping from the bit. You might think of the hugger slipping free to wander. You might consider the possibility that the world after dark is not empty, but full of stories, full of presences, full of the ancient understanding that humans share the night with forces older than history, and that this sharing, when approached with respect, is not something to fear, but something to honor. The Old Norse night, in all its strangeness and depth, is still there, waiting quietly at the edge of every sunset, for those willing to meet it on its own terms.